Hello, hello. This is the Arkham Sessions. My name is Dr. Andrea Letamendi, and I am joined by expert nerd, walking IMDb, Blu-ray DVD producer, Mr. Brian Ward.
I'm an expert in nerds. That's what I'm an expert in.
Yes, that's pretty much what I meant.
What are you an expert in?
Psychology.
Oh, that's convenient because we've got a show about psychology.
That's what we do.
Yeah. Welcome. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm okay. I have been under the weather for like 2 solid weeks. I just found out I had been suffering from not one, but 2 different types of the flu. So I am very happy to be on the mend and to be talking about Batman, the animated series. It seems like we've been waiting a long time to talk about this episode, Second Chance.
Yes, the return of Two-Face.
Yeah. So I'm eager to talk about Two-Face, primarily because this might be the first time that I can remember in the course of the series where a character is written significantly different than other times that we've seen him, in previous episodes.
Are you saying that rather than seeing this as character development, it's more like the character is just written differently?
Yes. You and I will have to re-examine the things we have said about Harvey in the past.
I will stand by what I've said about Harvey, even after watching this episode.
You can do that, but you and I have spoken off air about this a little bit. It is different in this episode. He is written, there is an added element where they're pushing something that they weren't pushing so hard before. And we can talk about that.
This is also, I think, one of the more divisive episodes.
Just between us.
Do you like that I said that? Yes, I brought that in?
That is true.
In terms of the feedback and the comments that we've gotten from listeners who I think are essentially having the same debate that we are around what is going on with Harvey Dent / Two-Face.
Right. So let's talk about what's going on with Harvey Dent / Two-Face. If everything had gone according to plan at the beginning of this episode, one of these 2 characters may not exist by the end of this episode. We see as Batman and Robin are watching Harvey Dent be wheeled into a hospital, and he's going to have surgery. We hear his doctor say something that's kind of interesting, and I want to get your take on this, Drea. Take a listen.
Your bad side is almost completely submerged. You've done very well in therapy, Harvey. You're more in control now, able to make decisions for yourself without relying on chance. Now it's time for the final step, erasing the scars that created Two-Face. I believe that once you are whole again, your mind will be strong enough to banish Two-Face permanently.
So essentially what they're saying is that emotionally, psychologically, cognitively, like he's made progress. He's been able to integrate his selves, his good sides, his bad sides. I don't mean his personalities. I mean some of his traits, and that he has recovered, and that they're going to cure him of the physical aspect of Two-Face. Like psychologically, he's fine, or he's better, and physically, they're going to remove the Two-Face persona to help him through the journey of recovery.
And there's a belief that if he's not having to see himself in the mirror as Two-Face, he could potentially go back to being Harvey Dent 100% of the time once again. Now, 2 things are sort of... I have 2 questions really about this. The first is...
Well, of course you have 2.
Well, yeah, exactly.
We're just going to make this whole show about
rules of two. And,
Two,
yeah. The first question, Drea, is that a reasonable assessment? I mean, is it a reasonable assessment that the only thing that's really plaguing him at this point is his visual appearance, and if he can just rid himself of that, then he could potentially be psychologically healed?
Not really. I mean, when I think about real cases where there's a severe injury, disfiguration, some kind of physical remnant of the trauma, you do try to have, reconstructive surgery, and you're going to have, obviously physically, medically, some opportunities for recovery. But I wouldn't necessarily say that you would try to hide the physical aspect of the traumatic event necessarily, right? So with the idea that like, oh, when you no longer see it, you're not going to be impacted by it. So to me, that seems like an extreme form of intervention for him.
And it makes one wonder if a surgeon is qualified to be making decisions like this, because she's the one that's about to, use the scalpel and
the surgeon is not the psychiatrist. They're
maybe
not the same person.
She's the one who is speaking to him right before they start.
Dr. Nora Crest?
Yes.
I thought she was the surgeon.
That's what I'm saying. She's the one who's telling him you're doing very well.
According to reports.
Oh.
Yeah, that's how I understood it. She's not his psychiatrist or psychotherapist or anything.
Right. So, yeah. So they start to, well, and that leads me to my second question. My second question is, when we first met Harvey, and we remember he had, before the accident, this sort of pent-up rage. In fact, he had named it Big Bad Harv. So it's not like it would, heal it entirely, because as we've seen, he had that personality before he was Two-Face.
Right. His physical disfiguration was not the cause of Two-Face.
Right.
He already had those tendencies and the traits of Two-Face. But as we've talked about before in a previous episode, the physical trauma, and I think it's probably fair to talk about the flashback that's actually in this episode, where we see what happened to Harvey from Batman's perspective, from his POV.
Harvey.
No.
Harvey. No.
It's actually quite sad, because it's his best friend, and he's watched him. He basically watched him run into a building, and there was this huge explosion, and of course broken wires fell into a vat of some chemical, and
it's his fault. I mean, it was
Right.
Batman's fault.
yeah.
I mean, had he not thrown, was it a batarang he ended up throwing, and it ended up severing the wires, and the wires then went into the vat, and then everything blew up, and it was all Harvey. Mm-hmm.
And that pushed him over the edge, right? Like the accident, the emotional, physical trauma then pushed Harvey over the edge to become Two-Face.
And it gives him an adequate reason to hate Batman.
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't realize Batman is Bruce, but it gives him an adequate reason to really loathe, the Bat.
Well, the interesting thing about the reconstructive surgery is that Bruce Wayne is paying for it. Mm-hmm. Like literally he's paying the bill.
And he's not just doing it because Harvey is his friend, though he is, that's sort of how it's presented, but there's also probably a great deal of guilt associated with the creation of Two-Face.
Well, I think it is because Harvey's his friend. Why else would he do it?
Well, because he's the reason Harvey, Two-Face exists. I think Batman is definitely riding the guilt train for quite some time. I mean, I think when it comes to Harvey, he can't afford to give up on him because unlike many of the other rogues, really unlike any of the other rogues, Batman is the reason this one exists. Mm-hmm. And had he not been there and done the right or wrong thing at the right or wrong time, Gotham City wouldn't have this rogue. And I think Batman...
He's responsible.
Yeah, I think Bruce feels responsible for that.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter because right as the scalpel is about to cut into... Well, this is a weird surgery too, because what are they going to do? His face is it's like his face has been burnt off.
Well, I imagine there's some sort of plastic surgery that can be done.
They're going to give him a
grafting and stuff. I don't know.
Well, right before that happens, a bunch of masked henchmen
with machine guns.
Yeah, they break into the hospital and kidnap Two-Face.
Yeah.
And take him out of there.
And they want to know, Batman and Robin want to know who is responsible for kidnapping Harvey, and they certainly have their list of potential suspects. Rupert Thorne is one of them. The Penguin is another. Now, Drea, you and I have discussed Arkham and their decision to allow the various inmates to have their totems, their plants or their coins or whatever. When they go to the Penguin's cell at Stonegate, so he's not considered
he's at
mentally
Stonegate.
insane.
Right, he's at Stonegate, so he's he's locked down in a prison.
Yeah. So when they go to his cell is wall-to-wall bird cages, and he has trained birds that are there hanging out with him, who he then unleashes on Batman when he comes to visit. Now, Stonegate apparently must be run by the exact same people as Arkham, because the last thing I would do is give a guy who's known to weaponize bird cages.
Well, but those they didn't give him birds. Those birds were from the skies. Like he was able to communicate with the birds of the city, and they came to him.
And that may be
through the window,
right? But they're letting him keep bird cages in his cell, and not only that, maybe if you're worried that a guy who can communicate with birds could then weaponize them, maybe you give him a cell without a window, or at least a window that wouldn't allow a bird to come in and hang out with them and dance. It's kind of weird.
He
has them dance.
Well,
but I mean, I guess there are worse things you could do, but he does. He sends them and they attack Batman, and frankly, they do a pretty decent job because he falls and barely catches himself. And so both Batman and Robin discover that their two suspects didn't have anything to do with the kidnapping of Harvey from the hospital. They go back and they investigate the hospital a little bit more, and they find that that the criminals had, I guess, dusty shoes of some kind. There's a dusty footprint there, and that dust could be from only one place. And that's at this construction site, the former site of the Half Moon Club, which Harvey mentions in the beginning was the place that he and Bruce used to go and, dance the night away with the women and, close the bar down. And, he refers to it as the best time they ever had. So that's kind of sad as well. But Batman then realizes, let's go ahead and just reveal the twist that the worst enemy of Harvey Dent is none other than Two-Face.
Two-Face planned to kidnap his own body in order to save himself, Two-Face, and sabotage Harvey Dent's plan to eliminate Two-Face.
Yeah.
So clearly here, there's two motivations, two competing, I mean, in just a stark difference in what their motivations are, right?
Yeah. So Harvey reveals, or rather Two-Face reveals, that because Harvey was going to have him removed, he decided to fight back and wouldn't let that happen. So, Drea, this is the part that we need to talk about in regard to Harvey as he's been presented through the series so far. Up to this point, you have been saying that he has been exhibiting signs of something not necessarily dissociative identity disorder. Mm-hmm. You have mentioned in our very first episodes, we were talking about possibility of bipolar disorder. You had also mentioned a number of other sort of symptoms, and you had mentioned that DID does in fact usually come with other symptoms, and that it's a very controversial diagnosis, and that some people don't even believe that it exists. And up to this point, it had been
ruled out, you would say.
Kind of ruled out.
We ruled it out. And I think one of the reasons we ruled it out is that we could not find, well, there were many reasons, but we could not find two or more distinct personalities that were presented by this character, by this person, right? That what we need in order to diagnose him with dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder, was the presence of two or more distinct personalities that could not interact with each other, that they were essentially able to function separately and were not able to have conversations together. When one was present, the other would be dormant and it would be experienced as a blackout on Harvey's part. So we ruled it out because we couldn't find evidence for that. And there were better explanations for his mood swings and his irritability and his huge, deep difficulties with managing his own distress. And he was seeing a therapist, and he was getting treatment for managing that distress. And
when he was being put under hypnotherapy was what he was receiving.
And then he had this incredibly traumatic experience where he nearly dies and half of his body is disfigured, which sort of confirms for him that his identity is black and white, that it's one or the other, that he then relies on this coin to tell him what he needs to do because he's so conflicted.
Well, and that brings us to the question that I have, because you know, up to this point, he's been presented as one character who has two different perspectives, not necessarily two different characters, like you said. Although after this episode, I now have to wonder if maybe we just haven't seen Harvey. Maybe since the accident, we've basically just seen Two-Face. Maybe Two-Face is the one that needs the coin, but Harvey isn't part of that factor, because Harvey wants Two-Face gone. You can see that he's keen on reformation. He wants to live up to Bruce's hope and dream that his best friend will one day be okay.
Yeah, and he's participated in therapy. He's consented to this corrective surgery. Like he's basically compliant. We have some evidence that he wants to recover, and part of that recovery is to deny and eliminate this Harvey Dent persona.
Right. But Two-Face comes out and says, as if as a completely separate person, Harvey was going to have me eliminated, and I couldn't let that happen.
Yeah.
You know, so it wasn't like, I decided against having this part of me. I mean, he is, for the first time in the series, we are hearing Two-Face referred to Harvey as a completely separate character in a way that it almost seems like he's got to be a completely separate.
Well, I have trouble with that interpretation, because someone says he or she has this other identity doesn't necessarily mean they actually have another identity. Like,
No.
this is just the way that he's conceptualizing his experience and discussing, like, explaining what's happening to him. And I don't necessarily, like, that's insufficient for me to be like, well, he has DID.
No,
He
but-
said Harvey.
Right, but what I'm saying is we've never seen him written this way before.
I
and,
see.
And in this episode, he is doing everything he can to differentiate Two-Face from Harvey. I mean, even Batman says, no one hates Harvey Dent more than you. And Two-Face agrees with him. And he's like,
Well,
of course I do. Why wouldn't I?
Well, I think, like, if there's a part of you, and I want you to just go with me here and take a stretch, like, think in a flexible way. If you struggle with this mental health disorder, this illness, where there's a part of you that's very impulsive, angry, irritable, and acts out in a way that you don't really believe in, that you have trouble managing, that you can't control it, just think in a way, like, without putting a diagnostic label, like, just think in a way that sometimes you engage in behavior you're not proud of, and you engage in behavior that disappoints you and that embarrasses you and that makes you feel like less of a person, and that you disagree with that. So in this more symbolic way, I don't like what that person has done. And I mean, you hear people say things like, yeah, I don't like the person I was, or I don't like the person I was acting. You know, like, there's ways in which we talk about ourselves as if we're a different person.
I get it.
Now, we don't have
sounds-
names for that person,
Yeah.
but I can see this more as a symbolic. Yeah, Harvey is the big bad Harvey, bad Harv, right? Like, when he comes out, I don't like how he behaves. He's incredibly rude. He's mean. He's not me. That's not me.
Right.
Right.
I
So
get what you-
that's how I see this.
I get what you're saying. Yeah. I think we have to acknowledge that this is a cartoon, and that I think we have to acknowledge that when Jerry Conway wrote the script for the episode, he wanted to. I see what you're saying. I just don't know that I agree with that being what they were intending, because it's very, very heavy toward this person. They have given Two-Face almost a self-defense.
Yeah.
You know, like he felt threatened. He took over. It wasn't, well, on Monday I thought about getting rid of myself, but on Wednesday I realized that was a bad idea. Like, that's not how they're presenting this. They're presenting it as Harvey did it behind Two-Face's back. Two-Face found out, told his men to kidnap himself, did so, in
Right.
retaliation. Like,
okay, so in this fantasy world, I agree with you. Like,
Yes.
in this fictional universe, yes, this is a character that has two distinct identities.
But just for this episode so far.
Well, right. And if you were to tell me, I want you to map this onto real world psychology, that's my explanation of it.
Right.
And I'm saying, yeah, you know what? There is a diagnosis called dissociative identity disorder. And I would still at this point would say this fictional character does not have that diagnosis.
Okay.
There's insufficient evidence. And as you know, in the real world, there's lack of evidence for DID in general.
Right.
So I would be really reluctant to use that label for this fictional character if we were to map him onto the real world. There's so many other explanations for this character that to me make more sense.
Okay. So Batman is once again captured, because he's pretty much captured in every episode. And Two-Face has to use the coin to figure out, whether he's going to kill him in this way or another way, blah, blah, blah. And the coin gets flipped, and Batman insists that he sees how it lands. So he wants it to hit the floor. It hits the floor, and it hits or lands on edge.
He's like, I want to see it hit the ground.
And
He was very adamant about that.
Well, and you find out later he needed to see it hit the ground. And so Two-Face, freaks out. He needs to know the outcome. He flips it again. It hits the ground. and again lands on edge. And it continues to do so until eventually Two-Face chases it off of an I-beam and, nearly falls to his death, and Batman catches him. And he says to choose between the coin or your own life.
Well, and he explains that the coin is a trick coin.
The coin is a trick coin. It would always land on its edge.
Yeah, because at some point he switched it out before he was tied up.
Yeah, when they caught him, he switched out the coin. So Two-Face, who kind of slips into Harvey in order to drop the coin, he drops it and then says, Batman, help me.
Yes.
And he reaches his hand up to grab hold of Batman's other hand and get pulled up. Just as Batman is going to help him, Two-Face then kicks in and says, "Never!"
Well, and to me, the way I interpreted that is that Two-Face heard Harvey Dent ask for help. He heard his pleas and is responding to that, to which I say, again, this isn't DID, because the criteria for DID explicitly demands that those distinct personalities cannot interact with each other. They are not able to have a conversation with each other. So technically,
and I would argue, though, that it's possible. Let's just say, since we're going into hypothetical scenarios here,
right.
Let's say you have DID and you are one character who doesn't want to die, and you're saying, "Hey, Batman, help me." And then a moment later, your personality switches, and all you see, having not heard your previous identity say, "Batman, help me," all you see is Batman holding on to you, trying to pull you up. And you hate Batman. So the very first thing you would say maybe is never, and punch at him. So having
and
not
then
even
fall,
heard,
but he would fall to his death.
he would rather fall to his death than because he hates Batman. Batman is the reason he's there. I think it's possible to say he didn't necessarily hear Harvey so much as he saw Batman helping him, and that is a bad thing for Two-Face.
I can see that. I can definitely see that.
And in fairness, I can see your way too. So
there's two ways to look at this.
Oh, I see what you did there. Mm-hmm. So he does punch Batman and he falls. Batman then comes after him, and Batman is even sort of rescued by Robin at this point, because Batman has given up his life to go save Harvey. And Robin swings in and sort of helps them both out, and says it's a good thing that he had been there. Now let's talk about
He's like,
why.
It's a good thing I'm such a good friend to you, Batman.
Well,
I look out for you.
Yeah, let's talk about why Robin hadn't been there up to this point. So we've seen that Batman can get a little edgy when it comes to Harvey, and we discussed why we think that is. I think he's got that guilt going.
Yeah.
But at one point, when they are chasing the ambulance or the car and the van that may or may not have Harvey's body in it as they're escaping from the hospital, Batman splits off and goes after one. Robin splits off and goes after the other, and Robin nearly stops the car that does in fact have Harvey in it, but they get away. And Robin says, "I'm sorry, I couldn't stop them." And Batman's response is a little cold.
"I'm sure you did your best."
Don't gush all over me. It's embarrassing.
"Sorry. Harvey's my friend. I'm worried about him."
Right. And I'm just the kid in tights.
Yikes.
Yeah.
A couple things. Of course, two things. One, I didn't think what Batman said was terribly cruel.
No, it wasn't,
and callous.
yeah.
Like, it was just like, you did your best, So I thought that Robin was getting really defensive. And then the whole thing about the best friend, that was painful. If you think about it, this whole time, Harvey Dent is still seeing, this is revealed to Robin, like, you won't be my best buddy. Like, we hang out, we go on these adventures together, we protect each other, we're brothers, but
and
you're
yet
not my
I
best
still
friend.
like Two-Face more than
Right.
you.
Like, it's just painful. And Robin, I think he has a right to be upset because, Bruce/Batman would be his go-to. Like, I think he would say Bruce Wayne is my best friend, right? Like, if you asked him.
Yeah.
And sadly, Bruce Wayne would say Harvey Dent, who he hasn't really seen in forever. So it's just this real sad encounter. This interaction was really upsetting.
And I find it kind of interesting at the end of the episode, they're wheeling Harvey Dent back into Arkham Asylum, and Bruce is there, ready to let him know that he's still got his friend there next to him, and Harvey stops and says,
Bruce, good old Bruce, always there. You never give up on me.
and then this exchange happens.
He's right. You're always there for him.
Yes. Just like you're always there for me.
Hey, what are friends for?
It's just so one-sided.
Yeah, like
it was never resolved. Like,
it's not like just like we're always there for each other.
Yeah, you'd
It's-
think it would be resolved at this point. Like to end the episode on Batman somehow demonstrating that Robin is his new best friend, or but it's like.
But instead,
what?
it's Harvey's my best friend and I'm your best friend. Like, it's
Oh, it's so weird.
yeah, it's a little bizarre.
Poor Robin.
Yeah. So, Drea, what was your take on this episode?
Well, we certainly. Well, the whole Robin thing for me was every time we have this type of interaction, it just adds on to, unfortunately, the dynamic between Batman and Robin. It's not as perfect. They're not the dynamic duo, right? Duo. They're not the dynamic duo without flaws. Like, their relationship has some gaps and some issues as well. But we certainly have to address this new Two-Face character that I agree with you that the presentation of this character is slightly different. There's this emphasis on the duality, on the separate identities. But I still, in the same way that there are multiple and maybe better explanations for real life patients who may appear to have DID, we could have alternate explanations for Two-Face in this episode.
Okay.
And I guess we didn't really talk about dissociation a lot in the last episode that featured Harvey Dent / Two-Face, but we could look at this like, is it possible that he's experiencing states of dissociation but doesn't have DID? Does that make sense? Like, dissociation meaning this break in continuity in terms of his perception, his emotions, his reality, that there's this, there are moments he experiences where he has identity confusion, memory loss, derealization, depersonalization, that are not necessarily explained by DID, but could just be series of dissociative states, essentially.
Right.
Do you think that might be a possibility?
I think that could be a possibility.
I guess what I'm arguing for is state dissociation versus trait dissociation. So
okay,
let's
so
break
explain
that down.
Yeah, tell me what that means.
So state dissociation refers to an experience where you have a moment of lack of continuity in your reality. So it's a moment, it's an experience. Like, let's think of a few. Like sometimes between sleeping and waking up, you're in that weird zone where your reality, like your perception is altered. Sometimes you think you're awake, but you're actually still dreaming. Or you might hear or see things and you're not quite awake yet. So that's a lack of continuity in your perception and your reality. There are other times where, for a lot of us, this has happened where we're experiencing a traumatic event. And I've heard a lot of people say, like, it almost feels like they leave their body, or they're looking at their body from above or from the side. Like they're actually perceiving their body as if they're separate from it. That's not uncommon. There are one could argue that just having lack of attention on what's happening in front of you, like, how did you get to work this morning? Do you remember every stop sign, every traffic light, every merge to a different freeway? Like, sometimes that could be completely outside of our perception. So I would say, like, there's a spectrum. There's a number of different ways in which we would have altered attention or state dissociation, where we couldn't really understand what was going on in the moment, or we weren't tuned into what was going on in the moment. Whereas trait dissociation is like a part of your identity is dissociated. You have a complete alter. You have a much more fundamental, long-standing dissociative trait where it's not just a moment, but a complete identity shift. And so for folks who say that they have DID or report multiple personalities, they will describe shifting between, from one to another with these long periods of lacking the memory or having memory disruption, blacking out, not knowing where they are or who they are, ending up in places that they don't remember getting there. So those types of reports are much more difficult to find evidence for because, for one, they're incredibly rare. So you have very few people reporting this compared to other mental health disorders or illnesses. And the controversy seems to stem from some cases where people claim to have DID and then actually later disclose or reveal that they do not. So there's this like high profile case where a guy, are you familiar with the case, like maybe in the 80s?
What was it, the killer?
Yes.
Yeah. The killer who had been using it as his self-defense, and he ended up like pointing out where he had killed the bodies or hid the bodies or something like that.
Right.
And he was trying to say that like his other identity, Steve, had been the one who had killed them or something like that. And then it came out that he was
like there was no Steve.
Yeah, he was a complete liar.
Yeah. Which is like that movie with Edward Norton.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. Primal Fear.
Right. So we have these cases, and this isn't true for other mental health disorders, where there's this higher prevalence of malingering and other motivations that better explain the presentation of this. And so that's why that diagnostic label is so divisive itself, because some practitioners just don't believe that it's an actual phenomenon, and others do. The ones that do have presented some studies. There's a really fascinating study of a woman who not only claims to shift from one personality to another, but who can do it on command. Like if you told her, like, I want you to shift to William, who's like a 6-year-old boy. I want you to shift to Bobby. And, she'll be able to shift from one identity to another.
In fairness, that's not a big feat, is it? I mean, if you asked me to shift my identities on command, I could do it right now.
But again, with the premise, with her reporting that she has no interaction among these identities, that these are her personas, these alters, if you will, that when one is present, the others are dormant and aren't aware of it.
Wouldn't that go against the idea that there's no interaction, in that you are able to like call them up? you have to be able to, you have to be consciously making the effort to pull out a particular personality, and therefore there would be some sort of handoff there.
Right.
So,
or that you have control, like that tells me you have control over it.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's so many issues with that in itself. But what they did with her, and there's video of her online talking about her identities. There's a study that her psychiatrist did with her where she would go into an MRI and she would be given the instruction to shift to a different identity, and to what they would do is they would measure her brain activity while she was shifting. And so as I was happy to hear while I was watching this video and reading up on this study that they had a control arm, if you will, to this study, in that they would then ask her to pretend to be a different person. And they said that was a neutral control scenario in the sense that, okay, one is her, remember they're like measuring her brain activity, right? So one is this woman actually shifting to various alters. Mm-hmm. And the other situation is her pretending to be somebody who is not one of her alters. So the premise is that, well, we would see if there's differences in neural activity, given that that neutral scenario is just her saying, oh, I'm pretending to be Jimmy Joe. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So what they found is that in the brain scan results, there was more activity in the hippocampus when she was claiming to shift from one identity to another. So the hippocampus has various multiple functions, but one function is to manage memory. Their claim was that this is a distinct neurobiological, like this is proof that she's shifting from one identity to another just based on this brain activity being different than the brain scan of her pretending to be a different identity.
Okay, so I hope you're going to say the exact same thing here in a second. I find that a bit suspicious. Only because if I spend years creating characters, like creating personalities, mm-hmm. and creating memories for those individual personalities, right. And if I spend all that time creating this that may not actually exist, but I have created a world for them, mm-hmm. It'd basically be like, hey, J.K. Rowling, I want you to channel Harry Potter right now. Now I want you to create an entirely different character. She's got years and years and years of memory, right. and information that only she knows about those characters. If you then get her to create a different character, it will activate an entirely different part of the brain, right?
Why did I even get a PhD? I don't think I need one. Yes, you're right. And in fact, a neurologist who specialized in interpreting brain scans was commenting on this very study, and had said basically what you're saying, that it's not really a great method. Like the study lacks really good methods because that neutral scenario, we wouldn't expect to see a lot of brain activity in that particular part of the brain because it's not going to elicit the same memories that this persona that has been such a close, part of this person mm-hmm. would. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. There are issues with that study, but unfortunately you have a lot of psychiatrists and researchers utilizing those types of investigations to better understand and prove that this is a real diagnosis. Now, if you were to ask me, I don't really care what label you use, right? Like, what's more interesting to me is what's causing distress. Is the person seeking therapy? How can we best integrate those selves to ensure that that person has a high quality of life? Like, to me, I'm drawing back to Harvey. I would be interested in what does the core personality want out of his life? Like, a part of us understands that he's identified a self, a trait that he doesn't like, that is a bully, that is negative, that is harmful and destructive, and he doesn't want to be that person. And so that's what I would really focus on with him.
So Drea, over at our IMSI community, we got a question that I think is pretty great, and I'll let you take this. Hira Singh asks, a common thing that is said about Bruce and his black and white perception of the world. Everything being good or bad. In many incarnations of Two-Face, Bruce has always been there to financially support Harvey to recover, physically and emotionally. His aggressive display toward the Riddler upon his release is a far cry from his demeanor toward Harvey in this episode, suggesting a deviation from his usual black and white thinking. How do you feel Bruce/Batman would react if other rogues came up to him and said, "I need help. I don't want to be this way anymore"?
Wow. That is a great question. I think it depends on who it is. You know, like, obviously Harvey Dent has a history with him, so he would do anything he could to help him. Hurt Robin's feelings forever and ever, apparently.
Right. Yeah.
I think that he would consider what that would mean for him. I mean, it's a selfish perspective, but I even believe that Bruce would want these folks to stay in Arkham Asylum. Like, he has such a rigid perspective on what makes a person evil, like what makes them a villain, that for some of these rogues, he would want them to stay in Arkham Asylum.
Ooh, that brings up an interesting question. So even if you are fixed of your physical, injuries, you may acknowledge that that person still requires therapy and could continue to require therapy, maybe even for the rest of their lives. Do you think that Bruce has an expectation that Harvey would be able to just jump right out of Arkham Asylum and live as Harvey Dent? Or do you think that Bruce would be like, look, I want to rid you of Two-Face, but I still think you should be here, getting help?
I don't know. Well, Harvey's a little different, but we have covered a lot of episodes that deal with rehabilitation and recovery, right? Where somebody has done their time or they've done well in therapy and they're given a second chance. And Batman continues to be suspicious, pessimistic, kind of always seeing them as, he judges by their destructive criminal behavior, and he predicts their behavior based on what they've done before.
I do wonder what would happen though if someone came up to Bruce Wayne and says, "Hey, I heard about this thing you were doing for Harvey. I don't want to be this way. Could you?"
What do you mean? Like Clayface would be like, rah, 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 rah.
Yeah, exactly like that. No, not even a, hey, could you fix my physical abnormality? But in a, hey, you're so supportive of Harvey Dent. I was wondering if maybe you could help be my benefactor in a recovery because
yeah, okay,
you're so philanthropic. Like, I wonder what would happen if one of these rogues came up to Bruce and said, "Look, I don't want to be a villain anymore." Not knowing that you're Batman.
I know. I mean, I think he'd be like, okay. And then he'd be in a tree out like with binoculars staring at them, waiting for them to misstep. So I'm not saying he wouldn't help them. I'm saying he might participate in their rehabilitation, but he would also stalk them until the end of days because he would expect them to to revert back to their old ways.
And as we've seen him do in the past, he might drive them into reverting back to their old ways.
Right.
So,
and we've talked about this before, that he needs them to be bad. Like, he doesn't understand himself unless villains exist, because he knows he's on like the cusp, like he's on the edge. He is close enough to being a bad person.
Yeah.
These are his like really deep down negative thoughts that he thinks about in bed at night by himself, right?
Yeah.
And so he needs them to be clearly bad without question.
But the one that he wouldn't mind actually reforming would be Harvey.
Well, Harvey confuses him. I mean, the duality with Harvey and Two-Face is not so different with Bruce's own conflict, in that Harvey and him were like besties. So if Harvey can go bad, what does that say about himself?
Right.
So I think he looks at Harvey a little bit differently, but for the most part, all the other villains, like he needs those villains to stay bad.
Batman's messed up.
He's fine.
So ultimately, what did you think of this episode, Dre? Did you like it?
I did. I really did like this episode. I know that I agree with you. There are some inconsistencies if you were to string together some of the Two-Face episodes. This one is written a little. They wrote him a little differently in this, with more emphasis on the dual personalities. But I looked at it, and you know I'm going to say this. I looked at this like Harvey's conflict, because this really was about Harvey wanting to rid himself of Two-Face, Two-Face wanting to be the dominant personality, right? So like the conflict was very present. And the way I looked at it was, this speaks to many people who struggle with mental illness, that if it's, you know, I don't even need, I feel like I don't even need to name particular categories or labels, but for folks that do struggle with impulsive behavior or destructive behavior, self-harm, relationship conflicts, marital discord, whatever, like most of us would say like, yeah, there's some stuff that I'm not proud of. There's behavior I've engaged in that I don't really feel great about. And I would take that further and say that for Two-Face, he's representing folks with mental health disorders who truly want to get better and truly want to rid themselves of that set of behavior that is not like them, and they don't feel like it's them. It's not part of their identity. And yet when they're in that episode, whether it's a manic episode, depressive episode, you know, whatever, impulsive, it takes over, and it wants to be there. It wants to drive, you know, wants to be the driver, wants to be in charge. And that, I think, is a real struggle. So for me, it was more of a symbolism, if you will, of that struggle.
Nice.
Well, you asked.
Well, and you told me, and I appreciate that. I liked this episode a lot. You know, for all those same reasons.
Sure.
You know, I saw it as symbolic, all that. No, I really liked this episode, and I liked being able to have the conversation with you about maybe how some of these characters changed, because we don't often see characters with significant changes to the way they're presented, and this gave us a great opportunity to take a look. Drea, until next week's episode, where can folks find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc. My website is underthemaskonline.com.
You can find us both on Twitter. We are at Arkham Sessions. You can find me. I am at bward028. You can also find us over at Facebook and at our IMZY community. That's imzy.com/Arkham. And go request to be a member of our community, and you can engage in all kinds of great conversations that we're having over there.
That's where essentially these discussions continue to happen.
Yeah.
And I want to say hello to a few of our friends, Cecilia, Leah, Sully, Bernard, some folks who have been really active in the community, as well as through email, Twitter, and ways that they've interacted with us. So I just want to give them a shout out.
Very cool. And of course, be sure to go and visit our family over at Fanboy Comics. They are about to become rebranded as Fan-Based Press. That starts on May 2nd. But until then, you can go to fanboycomics.net and follow all of their goings-on over there. And, of course, you can follow them on Twitter. They are at fanboycomics. On Twitter, comics is spelled with an X. Until next week, when we will visit Harley as she goes on a little holiday.
I will say this is... Do I say this each time? This is like one of the most talked about episodes.
Yeah, we do get requests for this one a lot.
I will ask people then to go on IMSI or on Twitter
or on Facebook.
And ask us questions, because there's going to be a lot to talk about, and I want to make sure that we address some of the more important things that people really, really want to hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. So until next week for Harley's Holiday, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.
Don't gush all over me. It's embarrassing.